Well, while you all struggle to get those gruesome images out of your mind, we'll get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. I'm the editor of Foreign Policy magazine and a Halifax board member, and I did not make that video. We've been given a rather daunting assignment for this panel: international law and the global order, right? But as I see it, this theme is really just another way of talking about what we've been talking about this weekend already, and the subject that preoccupies so many of us these days, which is the general decline of the post-World War II rules-based global order. In this conversation, we're going to try and focus on a few specific aspects of that problem. To use the metaphor used in the video, if the international rules-based system is the roads, the interstate highways, our job on this panel, I think, is to talk about the infrastructure that supports those highways, the rules, the norms, the institutions, the traffic cops. That infrastructure is, of course, what has allowed the overall system to produce so much peace and prosperity over the last 70 years. And that infrastructure is currently decaying while simultaneously being attacked by all sorts of vandals and saboteurs. So what is the state of play and what can we do about it? For answers, let me quickly introduce our panelists and then we'll get right into it. On my far right is Nancy Lindborg, President and CEO of the U.S. Institute of Peace. Next is Peter Maurer, he's the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And finally, on my immediate right, Lassina Zerbo is Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. So, Peter, I want to start with you, if I may. There's been a lot of talk in recent years about a global crisis in human rights specifically. Now, part of this concern is easy to understand because we currently have a US president who cares less about the issue than any other in recent memory. The West is divided and preoccupied with its own problems. At the same time, populists and authoritarians are rising around the world. But as bad as things may look, what I want to ask you is, were they ever actually that much better? After all, throughout their history, it seems that human rights norms have more often been honored in the breach than in the observance. And the one period where the West really seemed to get its act together and be prepared to act on this problem, namely the 1990s, now looks more like a brief aberration in the arc of history than like a trend. So are things truly so much worse today than they were in the past?
Well, a good question, and one we are struggling each and every day to assess. What we certainly see is that there are outrageous violations of law in many of the theaters of conflict that we are looking at, having received the task of the international community to look after the Geneva Conventions in situations of war and conflict, but also violations of human rights. And we see this huge discrepancy between a normative system which has evolved rapidly over the last 70 years and the lack of respect of those norms on a day-to-day basis. On the other hand, if I look just at the Geneva Conventions, which is the most largely ratified international treaty in the post-war world, all states have ratified it. If I look at our work, this is more of a glass half full and half empty. We see in our engagement with more than 130 armies worldwide that there are serious efforts to train, to respect international humanitarian law, to respect these norms and principles in combat operations. We are engaging all over with arms bearers in situations of conflict, and we see that there are credible efforts to respect. And so I think we have to nuance our talk of a degrading order. The system is here. The discrepancy are unquestionable there as well. The efforts to respect are here. And we have taken a deliberate effort over the last couple of years, not only to look at violations and degradations, but also to see where does the law function? Where is it respected? And how can we build on the respect in order to enlarge respect? So I think I wouldn't buy into the degradation order, into the degradation respect either. What we see broadly is this paradoxon of progress, where on the one side we see progress of respect, also translating into better lives for people and better social and economic situations. And on the other hand, we have places of fragility and disrespect, which are at the origin of most of the problems with which the international order is coping today. It always strikes me to see that the 20 largest operation in which the International Committee of the Red Cross is active today is responsible and at the origin of 80% of all irregular displacements in the world. So there are these hyper-fragile places which are places of exclusion, of injustice, of disrespect of the norm, of big discrepancy with which we are struggling. But there are a lot of other places where good people try to respect rules and law, be them human rights or international humanitarian rules and laws.
Nancy, I want to ask you if you share Peter's optimism and add one more element to the question. A number of critics, like David Reef, for example, argue that part of the reason human rights are in the parlous state that they are today, if in fact they are, is not just the fault of the vandals, the leaders in the states who are abusing those rights or failing to support them, but of the human rights movement itself, which, according to some, pushed too far too fast during that great moment in the 1990s when anything seemed possible, and established principles like the responsibility to protect without ensuring adequate buy-in or enforcement mechanisms. And now we're all paying the price for that. What do you make of that?
Thank you, Jonathan, and it's great to be here at the Halifax Forum. I do share Peter's optimism. I don't share David Reef's critique, although he makes an important point that some of these conventions, and certainly R2P, was passed without the teeth required to enable it to work. Although, remember that in 2011, the UN Security Council did pass a resolution using the R2P mechanism that enabled the campaign in Libya. It was only after NATO enlarged that initial air campaign into regime change that Russia and China signaled, we will never allow R2P to be passed again. Right. So I think it's a more complex and more nuanced argument than David makes. There has been enormous positive movement, as you noted in your intro, since 1945, in all the ways in which we've been able to reduce violence globally. Also, the many, many conventions and legal institutions that have allowed us to make gains on human development. And as Peter said, where we have this concentration of civil wars, violent extremism, sources of out-migration and refugees is in this ever smaller group of fragile states, which are also, by the way, the most vulnerable to the predations of Russia and China that we've talked about so much this weekend. Mm-hmm. And, by the way, in some of the most repressive countries, you have citizens who have taken these rights conventions very seriously, and they are calling for their rights to be respected. So I think there's an interesting question of number one, are we in a moment of decay or is it disruption? And as we know from the tech industry, disruption always gives us an opportunity to refresh, to invent in the areas that need reinvention. And so how do we grab this as a moment of opportunity? Because we know there are barnacles on the system that don't work as well as we want them to. So how do we take this moment of disruption to reinvent? And number two, how do we appropriately support the citizen movements for those who have taken very seriously the basic fundamentals and the rights that we've all put into place over the last 70 years and support their efforts, they're leading it without getting in their way or being too heavy-handed, to continue to support the success of the people movements that we've seen sweeping the globes over the last several years.
Well, I want to come back to those last elements when we start to talk about solutions, but Lassina, I want to bring you into the conversation as well, and ask, what does the gradual breakdown of the system look like from your perspective, working on nuclear weapons as you do? Are we entering an era where the only thing that will ultimately protect us from nuclear annihilation is the logic of mutual assured destruction? Or do you feel like, despite the recent changes, the global treaty system is still robust enough that it will persevere and can be reinvigorated again?
Thank you. And thank you all for inviting me to the Halifax Forum. The global norm is completely fragmented. If you take nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, which is my field, can we say that norms are respected? I mean, we heard in one of the video the importance of the non-proliferation treaty. We heard North Korea and the importance of the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But the big problem in non-proliferation and disarmament is that we don't connect the dots. In one hand, we want to denuclearize North Korea. In another hand, we don't call North Korea to adhere to the basic principle, which is, for instance, in my particular case, stopping nuclear testing by observing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty or adhering to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And why don't we do that? Because many actors in the discussion have not ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And it's difficult for them to convince North Korea because he would say, I mean, if you have to clean your doorstep before you tell me to clean mine. But if you take the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, how today can we consider that it is possible without injecting a dose of the norm that manage the non-proliferation in that peninsula, i.e. making sure that North Korea announcing that they've destroyed the nuclear test site, it's verifiable. Have we done this? We just look at a video where they blew the test site, or probably the tunnel or the entrance of the tunnel, and then we have to believe in it. But who can verify that they can't resume testing on the same site in the next 5 or 10 years? Nobody has taken this up. And then how do we call them to join the international norm by, we talk about imposing sanction. I mean, the North Koreans say if the sanctions were working, they wouldn't be at the stage where we have doubts that they have a nuclear weapon or not. And my big problem in talking about this norm is when I travel the developing world. When I'm in Africa, briefing university students or Latin America, what they tell me is the word double standard that we heard yesterday. How come can you talk about, can you sit today with North Korea that is testing, and then, for instance, Iran has never tested, and then we're putting so much pressure on Iran? Those are the questions that I get from students in the developing world. They're difficult questions to answer. And then when you come to Africa, they would say, South Africa has dismantled its nuclear weapon completely. Where do we stand? Should Africa made sure that South Africa keeps this so that, for instance, they have a voice and possibly be having a voice at the Security Council? I'm just throwing those questions to say that things seem to be fragmented and then nobody believes in his neighbor. There's a deficit of trust, as mentioned by Antonio Guterres in the video, and that's something that we have to deal with seriously.
Nancy, let me come back to you, and I'm going to jump to another aspect now of the international system, which has already come up a few times, the Security Council, and it's on this theme of disruption and double standards. Clearly, part of the reason that key bodies like the Security Council aren't working today is because key players on that body are either malign and competent, like China and Russia, or malign and incompetent, like the Trump administration, or benign but incompetent, like France or Germany. But there's another reason that the body isn't working very well, and that's because, according to many, it no longer reflects the reality of power around the world today. The UN Security Council very much is a post-World War II club, and we're not living in a post-World War II world anymore. And yet, how do you think about, on this theme of disruption, how do you contemplate changing an institution, a key institution like the Security Council, when many of the countries demanding a larger role don't share the same values as the founding members?
There have been many trees killed as people write papers about how to reform the Security Council. And maybe this moment of disruption will enable one of those solutions to fully go through. But in the meantime, what we're seeing are a lot of alternative ways for people with shared values to come together in alliances and mechanisms for moving forward the kind of values that evidence has shown us lead to greater stability, greater prosperity in the community of small d democracies. And I would cite the Paris Peace Accord in the previous panel. We heard about the importance of not just thinking about sovereign states as key actors, but also business. I would bring civil society into the conversation, that there are a lot of other actors and groupings that become absolutely critical for moving forward the norms and for moving forward the ways in which people can come together for positive collective action. And so whether it's regional institutions, that we're seeing the AU and ECOWAS and some of these regional institutions playing an ever greater and more positive role and advancing these shared norms, I think the arena has shifted. And the ways that we can look to and invest in those various collections and arenas where the values and the shared interests are coming together become the way that we look for carrying forward those key values that have served us so well over the past 70 years. And that's not to say that you abandon those core institutions or alliances, but rather that's sometimes we need to shore them up with other more effective mechanisms.
Peter, let's stay on this theme because I want to hear about your perspective leading such an old and powerful non-governmental organization. We are at a moment where, as Nancy was alluding to, a lot of the action to renew the system, rethink the system, is not coming from the traditional great powers. Clearly, there is a role for NGOs, but it's tricky given that we're dealing with a system, international law in general, in which traditionally the only players, the exclusive players, were nation states. So what can an NGO do very specifically to address these general problems that we're talking about?
Well, let me maybe choose different entry points. First, I wanted to come back to this issue of values and trust. I think we have to deconstruct a little bit on where the problem is. What we encounter in many places is that it is useful eventually not to highlight the divergences on values or the lack of consensus on what the norms and values are, but to focus also on challenges of implementation, to focus on obstacles to overcome, to focus on trying to bring people together to have a same interpretation in a specific case of norms, instead of just broadly stating that there is no common basis. I think if we take a systemic view on where we have challenges to respect norms and principles in the places in which we operate, I think it is important, exactly as you mentioned, Jonathan, to have a broader view and to see who are influencers of behavior and how can we somehow get the hooks and the screwdrivers where there are influencers of behavior. If we take today's battlefields where international humanitarian law is respected or violators, who is behind those who carry guns, who violate international humanitarian law, and how can we leverage influences of those behind? I give you an example. I mean, in Iraq, for instance, we have worked with religious leaders in order to get their voice for the respect of certain norms and principles. And religious leaders can be powerful influencers with people on the ground to ensure respect. In other places, we see that mobilizing communities and supporting local communities and local community leaders can be powerful entry points in order to ensure respect of norms in the battlefields. In third instances, we see that with the assemblage of actors that we find in the battlefield, states have influence over other states. And they can open doors to have, for instance, International Red Cross having access to detainees, having access to civilian populations, having access to battlefields, and having access to training rooms of armed forces. So these are access roads to engage in a discussion on the application and the concrete meaning of the norms, rather than trying to establish whether we have exactly the same views on values. And so I think we have to deconstruct the value discussion and not presuppose that in a fragmented world we all think about exactly the same way on certain norms. But we have to create and recreate situational agreement that this and that is unacceptable, or this and that has to happen in certain circumstances. And here I think the civil society engagement, the influencers' approach, the idea of looking at the system and see where we can build pressure point is of critical importance to ensure respect for norms within society, but also in very difficult contexts in which we operate.
Lassina, do you have this kind of option to effectively go over the heads of governments and write to the people themselves when it remains the fact that it's the governments who have to sign the treaties and it's the governments who control the weapons?
The option that I had recently was to involve youth. What we've done is going above government is difficult for international organizations because in my case, we answer 284 countries that have signed. And then because of 8 remaining, we are in this limbo. But engaging youth has changed the dynamic a little bit with the CTBT, because if you take India and Pakistan that have not even signed the treaty, we have more young Indian and Pakistani involved in the CTBT youth group than any other nationality. We started 2.5 years ago with 9 people. We have 750 young people from 91 countries today. And they're now voicing their concern with regard to the entry into force of the CTBT and the overall non-proliferation and disarmament architecture. So they are the only one who can speak for us, because I have some constraint with, I have to basically follow what states are saying. And the young people talk freely, and then they will write articles that will be helpful for us to refer to, and then to help change the dynamic. And when you talk about young people, you talk about civil society and NGOs that are basically helping the treaty right now. But one thing I wanted to mention is the disconnect that is coming between the overall non-proliferation architecture and some of the internal norms like the CTBT, the Chemical Weapon Convention, and many other issues. Nancy mentioned the regional institution, how to involve, for instance, the African Union and ECOWAS. And someone mentioned as well that some of the vulnerable countries are left to the predation of China and Russia. I wouldn't take it this way. I want to say that it's because there is a void that others have left, that the others are filling. And if I take the example of my own example as somebody who has studied in Europe, at a time where there was a movement of young scholars going to Europe or to Russia, and today we see more African students coming to Canada or going to China than you see going to Europe. Why? Because
or the United States.
Or the United States. Or the United States, you're right. So, but United States, it will slowly start, changing because of obvious reason that we see, the difficulty to get visa, the difficulty to get to the university and so forth. So if I take my own case, when you study somewhere, you tend to have a certain attachment to that region. because you followed a little bit of the culture, of the way of doing business, and then you tend to interact with them if you are at the leadership position. That's a natural thing that you see. But the void that we see now has pushed most of the African countries to move towards China. For what? If you look at the relationship that China has with Africa, they came with one word that I want to use, is you come with respect. And then when you come with respect from our culture, you open your arms. And that's something that the Chinese have probably seen. But I'm not going to the economic and whatever that many people are criticizing. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a cultural way of approaching things that is helping making a difference in Africa that people are seeing. You take Russia. I met 2 years ago President Putin, and then the question was, why don't we have students from Africa coming to the Patrice Lumumba University anymore? I mean, you've seen in the recent Africa-Russia summit that they will now open their arm to African students to come because they want to change the dynamic, because they've realized that they've lost Africa because there was no connection between Russia and Africa. And Europe is going that direction. There are less and less students and less interaction between African student and European. And that will lead to, what the same deficit of trust that we're talking with. Where do I go? If you talk to a young scholar today, you say, where do you want to go and study? The first thing that will come out of his mind is Canada. And that is linked to what the mayor said yesterday, that Canada is open arm and Canada is welcoming students. So they will come and then they will learn freedom and liberty in Canada, the way it is done and the way it is accepted. And I think this is a conduit that we have to try and use in many aspects when I take disarmament and non-proliferation. It's how you deal with this issue. We can't talk about non-proliferation and disarmament if you don't involve countries, for instance, like South Africa, in a way where we take into account and respect the fact that this is one of the first countries to have dismantled its nuclear weapon arsenal. And those are things that we have to do, and then educate people in that region to understand that non-proliferation and disarmament doesn't belong to the usual suspect. It belongs to all of us, because peace and security depend on all of us.
Great. Let's open things up now to questions from the audience. I think the first hand was right there, please. And please try and keep your questions short, which is another imprecation that always gets observed in the breach, but we don't have a lot of time. Thanks.
Thank you. Lincoln Bloomfield, Stimson Center. Thank you for your excellent comments. It's interesting to hear the glass half full, but I'm having a hard time letting go of the glass half empty. And when I look at Syria in particular, the Russians using munitions to bomb hospitals, Bashar al-Assad driving 5.6 million people out of the country who want to go back but can't, our friends in Turkey now clearing a zone and potentially conducting a forced population transfer, which to this lawyer, non-lawyer, looks like a violation of the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention, which hasn't happened yet. And the Quds Force and the Shia non-state militias helping all the way to the destruction of Syria. My question is there a role that is missing now for greater accountability? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Great. Lincoln, there are many other cases, not just Syria, where the glass half full clearly is in the foreground. And we are missing, I think, the ability of a concerted alliance to act in a way that would make a difference. I mean, there are many ways that you could deconstruct what happened or didn't happen that led us to this point in Syria. However, I liked Senator Kane's formulation of, he used to be worried about violent extremism, then he became worried about great powers, now he's worried about the U.S. and its inability or its unwillingness to provide that kind of leadership. I think actually all are true at the same time. None of those previous threats have gone away. And so it is a more complicated three-dimensional world. And yes, there is a need for more accountability. We've set up a lot of legal structures that enable it, the International Criminal Court and the Rwandan court mechanisms. I mean, we have a lot of mechanisms for accountability, but you also need the enforcement. And for that, you need a solid alliance of nations with shared values, supported by populations that share those values. So I don't think that's all destroyed. I don't want to be Pollyannish, but I think we just have a wake-up call that we need to take that structure and those values more seriously and to align them with our interests more vigorously, and to look at how democracies haven't delivered such that we're seeing this wave of nationalism, but also the wave of people in unlikely countries around the world where they are demanding a return to those democratic values. So I think we're in a moment of great complexity and churn, and I choose to be optimistic because I do see that there is a counter wave across the globe saying, we bought into that vision, we demand that vision, and we are going to act in very courageous, putting our lives on the line ways to get that back.
We need to start taking questions in groups now. So first, Alyssa Ayers, please, and then Paula down in front.
Thank you. Hi, Alyssa Ayers from the Council on Foreign Relations. Since we have two panelists with such deep experience in the humanitarian sector, I wonder if I could ask a question about whether you have any ideas, ways that the humanitarian response could be changed to perform better. We see over and over again in a case, for example, like the Rohingya, the international appeals consistently fall short, not able to deliver all the resources needed. Do you have some thoughts about how the structure that currently exists could be improved?
Thank you. Right here in the second row, please.
Thank you. Paula Dobriansky, Harvard University. I want to follow on, Nancy, your last comment. One of my professors at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, wrote a book. Admittedly, it was about American politics, about focusing on what he called the IVI gap, ideals versus institutions. Take that forward to the global order. And the fact that there's discontent that many of the institutions are not upholding the values, and there is real discontent and cynicism. Take, for example, the United Nations Human Rights Council, and how you have some of the worst offenders on it, and that's never been changed. So my question to not just you, but to the panelists, what are the kinds of reforms that can and should be taken at this time to really make a difference? And we have a changed international environment. We know what hasn't worked. How can we move forward and get more accountability?
Thank you. And then third question right here, please.
My name is Kinan Rahmani. I work with an organization called the White Helmets that has saved over 120,000 Syrians from under the rubble because the international law and global order has not been able to save any Syrians. Not to be redundant with the question that Lincoln asked, but we have in Syria the regime using chemical weapons over 340 times. We have Russia and the regime targeting medical facilities over 500 times. 50 hospitals have been bombed in the past 6 months alone. People don't realize that in northwest Syria, 1 million Syrians have been displaced just in the past 6 months. And so my question is, we have in Security Council that Russia continues to veto any kind of action. We have a United Nations, even on the humanitarian response, which actively coordinates with and works with the regime in a way that furthers the barbaric and brutal response of the Assad regime. And we don't even hear about it anymore. The regime has a seat at the United Nations. It still is recognized, and it's very easy to jump to the conclusions that I would like the international community to do, which is to stop the killing of the Assad regime. But what we're seeing is that there's not even any recognition of these continued crimes because of how immune we've become to the continued violations of the international law.
So what's your question?
The question is, how do we work through through international law and global order when there can be no accountability for years and years of systematic war crimes and
Great.
violations.
Thank you. So these questions all really relate to one another. How can we change the system to improve accountability, and what can be done to improve the humanitarian response on the ground? Peter, you want to start with that last part first?
Well, I would like to go back to acknowledge that, of course, the international system needs both components, better accountability for violations, as well as consensus building and involvement and understandings with whoever is part of that system to create understandings on the significance of the norms. And obviously, we don't have a clear understanding on where the accountability part of the system has to work and where the consensus part has to work, or the involvement part has to work. And we seem, of course, to have still big divergences of interest and big differences of interest almost on each and every situation which we are dealing with. And I think one of the big problems that we are encountering is also that we continuously discuss accountability and involvement and consensus building as opposite and different paths. I think they are heavily complementary, and they have to be complementary. They don't necessarily need the same actors. I mean, from a humanitarian perspective, my sense on the improvement of the system, we have underinvested in consensus building on what the humanitarian space is, because technically you can do a lot to improve the humanitarian response, but that's not the issue. The issue today in today's conflict is that we don't have safe humanitarian spaces for neutral and impartial humanitarian action to deliver humanitarian action based on needs and not on political or other priorities. And I think negotiating these spaces, having political support for neutral and impartial humanitarian action is something which is oddly lacking in the international system. We have a lot of controversy between the powers, but we don't have a lot of support for frontline humanitarian action and space. Then there is a lot of technical stuff which can be improved. But at the end of the day, I think what my institution represents now for 156 years has remained the same in today's conflict and in today's situations. We have to find minimal consensus on who is a weapons bearer on the ground to ensure respect for the basics of international humanitarian law. And this needs involvement, outreach, diplomacy, negotiation, and I think that's what is most lacking at the present moment in the present system.
Do you want to jump in, or should we move to the next question?
No, I can jump in. Just on what needs to be changed. I think this is a question that comes often. But what I want to mention is instead of what needs to be changed or reformed, can't we respect what we have already in terms of the norm? Where are we with regard to the international norm that exists, and who is respecting them and who is not respecting them? Can we deal with this issue first? Because the better we know of how to respect or not to respect, then we can think about how to reform in future. But first, we have to deal with the norm that exists and then make sure that we follow them. That's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Okay, we'll
so
take
Jonathan,
yeah.
I just want to jump in on the Syria question, because I think Syria really has underscored for us in the course of that really terrible tragedy all of the weaknesses of the international system, because in fact, from the beginning, there was an effort to work within the international legal structures to address the unfolding first revolution and then series of atrocities. And the systems were bent. You know, there was cross-border humanitarian assistance, a huge effort to get Security Council blessing for that. There was an ongoing process that OCHA led to try to get agreement that there was humanitarian suffering and atrocities underway, and China, Russia, and Iran, mainly Russia and Iran, blocked it and denied it continuously. There was an effort to get the chemical weapons taken out using legal conventions. It kind of worked, but it didn't address the ongoing bombardments and barrel bombs and constant violations. And so I think that will serve as the beacon of a case study, the wake-up call for all of us to say, how do we, and it goes to the heart of David Rees' critique of how do you put the kind of teeth into all the things that we've agreed to when the system allows there to be blockage to moving that forward. So this is one of the conundrums that we have. And it goes to Alyssa's question that there are lots of ways to reform delivery of humanitarian assistance, huge, very useful thinking about how to reform the institutions and the way it gets delivered. But the reality is that it's often the only thing moving on the chessboard. And people reach for humanitarian assistance because we don't have anything else that we can effectively deploy in terms of protection and human rights, addressing the human rights violation. And Syria is another example of that. There's been great humanitarian assistance, billions of dollars of humanitarian assistance, but it hasn't stopped the killing. And so we can't conflate humanitarian assistance with effective protection.
And Syria is also relevant and worrisome because clearly the system doesn't change unless there are severe crises. But one wonders if Syria is not bad enough, what will it take for deep-rooted reform in the system? We were supposed to see changes after Rwanda and Bosnia. It didn't really happen.
It did. It just hasn't.
It did, but it hasn't
moved all
worked,
the way.
right? And we took one step forward, and then after Libya, we've taken multiple steps back. Okay, some more questions on this side, please. That gentleman, and then we'll move over here. But first, the gentleman in the third row, please. Just wait for the mic coming down the stairs. And we're really short on time, so please keep it short.
Mustafa Barghouti from Palestine. And my question is, since Geneva Conventions were mentioned so many times, don't you think that one of the major reasons of disrespect to international law today is the fact that it is applied with double standard? I mean, you have the leader of the superpower like President Trump recognizing the annexation of occupied territories, Golan Heights and East Jerusalem. And now Mr. Pompeo is coming out saying that violating the 49th article of the Geneva Convention, which says that no occupying power can transfer its population to an occupied land. And still he says that settlements are not in violation of international law. In my opinion, these things that are happening are simply making so many people so disrespectful of international law. Thank you.
Well, I happen to think you're absolutely right, and it's an inherent problem with a system that ultimately relies on self-help and has no enforcement mechanism. So you end up with a Melian dialogue system where the strong do what they can and everybody else suffers what they must. Jean-Marie, I think you were next.
Jean-Marie Guéhenno, Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs and previously United Nations. I have a lot of sympathy for what Peter Maurer said, that we may disagree on values, but a focused approach to solve issues where there can be a consensus is the pragmatic way to go forward. But at the same time, we do need institutions. The values with the norms, if they are not backed by solid institutions, eventually they will wither away. And well, we have heard from Mr. Barghouti and others, I mean, the global institutions, they are under stress today. They are seen sometimes as reckless, Libya, or they are seen as paralyzed, Syria. Lots of hope was put in regional institutions, African Union especially, because in other parts of the world we see the OAS very polarized. In Asia there is no real, I mean there is ASEAN, but there is not a regional organization for the whole of Asia. Europe is very much inward looking at the moment, dealing with its own problems. So the regional organizations have their own weaknesses. Nevertheless, they may have a little more legitimacy because they are closer to the people. And the question I would like to pose is how can one better articulate, especially in the case of the African Union, those regional organizations with the global institutions? We see in the case of the African Union that the relationship is poisoned by issues of financing. And so we have an institution that might be able to move forward, but doesn't have the money to do it, and its member states are not prepared to really significantly increase their contribution. So how do we go about that?
Thank you. Love Singh. Just down the row, please.
Thank you, Lobsang Sangye, President of the Tibetan Administration. Dr. Lassina, you said instead of talking about the reforms of international institutions, why don't we talk about the ones we have and respecting about it? But China is already restructuring international institutions, for example, United Nations. Now, as the second largest donor to the United Nations, they are putting key personnel and monopolizing or pressurizing some agencies. For example, at the Human Rights Council, if you try to move resolutions on human rights violation in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, or anywhere in China, you will have more countries supporting China saying human rights is good than the countries who say there are human rights violations. Now, China is redefining human rights, and they have passed 2 resolutions where they have said development is better than democracy, food is more important than freedom. And more countries have supported those resolutions, and they're trying to make it a statute. If it becomes a statute, then human rights as we know it will be very different, will be over. So hence, how do we cope with that? The present system that we have is regressing, and people, because they're donating money and they're restructuring it, that's the challenge.
Then just pass the microphone back to Luis Rubio right behind you, please.
Thanks. Luis Rubio from Mexico. The premise is that the system based on rules and international law is desirable. But what happens when the main promoter of these values, of these principles, is the main violator? The US has been renouncing the treaties on weapons, 2 fundamental ones. It is challenging the alliances that have long withheld these institutions. And lately, at least rhetorically, it has been supporting the challenges of the established order. How do we cope with that?
Okay, I'm afraid these are going to have to be our wrap-up comments. So I'll go to each of you, and you can respond to any of these as you see fit. Just to remind you, we're talking about the problem of double standards, how regional organizations can better be integrated into the entire structure of international cooperation. How can we reinvest in an organization like the UN when China is increasingly dominating and shifting its emphasis to issues more of its liking and an approach more of its liking? And what do you do when the main proponent of international law becomes its biggest challenger? Take it away, we have 3 minutes.
Of course, there are double standards. The question is, and of course it is important, as Jean-Marie mentions, to work through different levels of institutions. It goes back to a point I wanted to make strongly here. The question is what you can do to create consensus given the differences of interest that we have in today's environment. And you can't overcome unless you stick your heads together and you formulate concrete ideas and concrete steps amongst states. Just blaming the other for the double standards. My double standards is not your double standards. That's what we are in at the present moment, and that's a no-go. And we will just turn around. And the second point I wanted again to make very powerfully, you don't escape from wherever you look at this international system to see what you can do yourself to respect the norms and to improve respect for the norms, because the vision that there is somebody only violating the norm and somebody only respecting the norm is just a biased vision which will not help us to move forward. So it is also looking at your own failures, looking at improving the norms, using the influence that you have on actors to ensure respect for norms. This is important in order to fix the system.
Thank you. Lassina?
The need of for institution. I think you mentioned the AU and the difficulty of financing. I don't think it's about countries not wanting to finding a financing mechanism for the AU. I mean, it's linked to many difficulties in Africa right now, priorities, where do we stand with regard to moving from the current structure of the AU to a new structure. I think President Kagame has tried to lead an initiative to find a financing mechanism for that. But how do you link the AU to the global issue? It's the way I will picture this is inviting AU to the table of discussion on global issue or having AU in the menu or on the menu. I think this is how we have to look at the difference. We cannot discuss issue of Africa without bringing AU to the table of discussion. I've seen many articles many mention Libya. I mean, the decision to attack Libya was done without involving the African Union, and that's something that is being discussed right now by the youth in Africa. I mean, those are issues that we have to look into seriously. If you want to involve Africa and the issue of Africa, you have to bring them at the table of negotiation. You don't just have to have them on the menu for the discussion. So now moving on to China. How do you deal with China's increasing influence in international organizations? I would try and separate the Human Rights Council with international organizations like the one that I'm heading. I've been of the view that to allow international civil servants to speak the truth and tell the truth so that people can follow the norms, we need probably to reform the way head of organization are elected. And I think that goes with every kind of election for head of countries as well. When you elect somebody for 4 years, and then he comes for 4 years, he's worried about winning his second term, and then there are some tough decisions that he's not ready to take. And I've been wondering if we shouldn't come up with, if it's a norm to give 2 terms to somebody, I mean, give them 8 years once, and then that's it. You don't have to go, so that the person who comes know that he has 8 years to fulfill his full responsibility with regard to the state signatory of the organization, and then he can move on. I think that goes with some countries as well. So that's something that we have to look at so that people don't suffer the influence for power within the organization. So now, I'll give you the example of the type of pressure that comes. I mean, if you take, some will tell you we pay 20% of the budget of the organization, we need 20% of staff within the organization. I mean, if you take the budget of Burkina Faso, it's probably 0.0001 of this organization that I'm heading. I shouldn't be at the head of the organization. So that's something that we have to look into to make sure that people adhere to global norms and principles that govern international organization and then the work of international civil servant. And then avoid that the pressure is not on the individual, but the pressure should be on what governs the organization so that there could be a balance from other countries to come so that the majority can always speak for the organization rather than the power of the money that you invest in the organization.
Nancy.
So these are enormous topics, each of the questions, and not to be overly glib in the minute I have to respond, but I think double standards are really at the heart of a lot of the issues that we're facing right now. A lack of adherence to our values and a divergence between interests and values. And whether it's the failure of democracies to deliver that we've seen after a great flowering of democracies, they didn't hold forth on their promise, and now we're seeing this decline in democracies. There, over and over again, we have seen that double standard and that divergence from what we state to be the goals and the values. So this offers us an opportunity. It offers us a big wake-up call. We are, all of us, spending a lot of time in fora like this, where there is a great grappling with these issues and a reaffirmation of the importance of institutions that are effective, of alliances that keep us focused on like-minded partners in upholding these norms and institutions. So at the risk of sounding overly glib, I think that we have the opportunity to grasp this moment of extraordinary disruption, of extraordinary rising levels of certain kinds of violence, but against a backdrop of a long peace and the backdrop of the fact that we have had all these developmental gains. So we have a lot of evidence that can back up the importance of these frameworks and these values, and when you have governments that are responsive to the needs of their people, you have greater prosperity and stability that is in everybody's interest. We all need to double down on figuring out how to breathe life back into those values and institutions. So you could be very glass half full. It's tempting to be, but I actually think it's a moment of energizing, and we are seeing this with youth across the globe. They are standing up, they are speaking out, they are putting their lives at risk, and we need to figure out how do we get on that train and make a difference for the future.
Well, that's a great note on which to end. I apologize because I feel like the conversation is just getting started, and I know many of you wanted to ask questions and I didn't get to you. But while I don't agree that food is more important than freedom like the Chinese do, I know lunch is next, so I would be unwise to keep going.
Nice.
Please join me in thanking Nancy Lindborg, Peter Maurer, Lassina, Zerbo. Thanks you.